Hi, everyone. Just to begin with some brief background, my name is Arnav. I'm a rising sophomore and I'm currently thinking about studying anthropology. Coming into the summer, working on Tiger Challenge, I was really excited to work on more of a social justice focused program, which I appreciated. And the kind of central idea that I was working with at the beginning was how to address the invisibility of anti-Asian American hate, in particular East Asian American hate. So that's what I had in mind when I was working on this. To begin, I want to share the story of one of the Asian American community members that I had the pleasure of talking to, but for privacy's sake, I'll be referring to them as Z just to keep their identity private. Z is an Asian American college student who recently left New Jersey to go to North Carolina for school, and they just finished their first year as well. But they've grown up and lived in New Jersey and in particular in Princeton their entire life. Through our conversations, I began to understand a lot about the difficulties that they face, in particular due to their identity as Asian American, which pervaded a lot of aspects of their life. Some of the most important ones that they described were a lot of pressure from family and parents in particular, maybe to go into certain fields and certain jobs. Oftentimes these were STEM fields. And though Z described themselves as luckier than some other people to not have to deal with this as much, especially as they got older, they described seeing this with a lot of their Asian friends and family friends that they've known for many years. And on top of this, not only from their own family, but they had to deal with many stereotypes from non-Asian American people who expected this same sort of proficiency and tendency for STEM that isn't necessarily inherent to Asian people. Additionally, another striking issue that Z spoke about with me was how they've seen Asian Americans stereotyped as often antisocial or quiet in society. And he described this as a belief that they often had imposed upon them, especially when they were younger. And it was something that they had to deal with by being especially outspoken and outgoing just to be treated the same as their non-Asian peers. They attribute it somewhat to how they grew up, as their parents often told them not to make too much of a fuss of the issues they faced, but they didn't blame it on their parents because they didn't consider it an issue with that. And though these experiences are that of an individual, they are representative of a lot of the issues that Asian Americans face in their social and professional lives in general. And moving into some of that more generality that we can see with it, these three ideas that I got from these conversations with Z and from my general audience that I was able to talk to were these main ideas: the myth of docility, which is the technical term for this idea of Asian Americans being viewed as passive or quiet in society. These cultural behavior standards where parents may encourage their children not to cause too much of a fuss over issues they face, especially when it comes to their identity. And lastly, this idea of public versus non-public facing jobs, which is to say that many of these fields where Asian Americans may be encouraged to go into, such as STEM fields that have engineering jobs or things like that, aren't easily visible to the public. And that makes it harder for non-Asian American people and for Asian American people to see themselves represented in spaces that maybe they might want to go into, but might feel like they don't belong in. In addition to this, I also thought that these three things were very important when considering the idea of invisibility in my project, because I feel like, for example, with the myth of docility, if Asian Americans are viewed as passive in society, then for non-Asian American people to be hateful towards them, if they don't feel like there's much response or much opposition to what's being said, then they won't be able to recognize the issue with what they're saying. Moving into some of the research and insights that I saw that kind of supported this in academic literature, that's kind of where I got this term of the myth of docility, which was to say that a lot of scholarly writing was able to identify this as a primary issue with how Asian Americans are perceived by outside groups, just being seen as not present in society in the same way that other people might be, which again leads to this idea of invisibility. And a real world manifestation of that I saw many times was that in the corporate world or in any managerial positions, Asian Americans were very often not promoted in the same frequency than that equally qualified people of other identities were. And for these non-public versus public-facing jobs, I was able to further see evidence of this in a lot of the data that I looked at, in particular with the Bureau of Labor Census data, which showed that Asian Americans were often most highly represented, more so than their demographic in the country, in these more background jobs such as software engineering or IT. And this was also further reflected in a lot of the college major demographics that I saw, where Asian Americans, roughly 45% of them chose to go into STEM fields as opposed to all other areas, which could be attributed to many of these stereotypes or from pressure from people in their family around them. Collecting some of these ideas, I began to think about what change do I want to make to address this issue. And in particular, I wanted to look at a lot of the work that has been done already on this subject to get some ideas on where I could begin. And when I began looking at it, I started to identify certain gaps in the work being done. In particular, I compared them on these two axes, the work they're doing in terms of, are they generally educating people, or are they trying to provide a specified solution to a particular issue that Asian Americans have to face? And then additionally, I looked at whether or not these organizations or educational institutions, if they were working with large groups of people or if they were working more with individuals. And the gap that I was able to identify was that there seemed to be not much work with individuals and specified solutions to them, which I think could be very powerful in a way that maybe presenting information to a group might not have a lasting impact, but working with individuals and really being able to connect with them could make more of a lasting change. From this, I began to develop some of my social mission ideas. And in particular, the statement I came up with was to increase the representation of Asian Americans, particularly young adults, in social and professional spheres, which is, again, connecting to this idea that they're perceived as passive, or in the professional world that they might be viewed as quiet and less likely to be promoted. I thought that this was a good way to encapsulate these ideas. And connecting it to a larger vision, I was thinking about the famous news reporter and media presence, Connie Chung, who, though inadvertently, was able to inspire a generation of parents to name their daughters after her, hoping that they would be able to embody some of her traits. I believe that if the work I do is able to inspire some people to enter more of these public-facing jobs and become a presence, kind of like Connie Chung, that we can create a cycle that would reach beyond this intervention. Then beginning to think about some of the ways that I would actually address this issue. Though it was tentative, I wanted to more particularly outline some of the areas in which I wanted to help. So the three that I identified were self-advocacy, as I've mentioned, the ability to kind of teach people how to speak up for themselves, how to not just take what what's being said to them lying down, and to make themselves more present in all of these different spaces of their lives. Again, promoting public-facing jobs. I think that the importance of this is the visibility of Asian Americans in society, such as media or television, allows for future generations to feel like they can see themselves in a space other than STEM, where they might feel is the only place that they belong. And on top of this, I think that even if the work I do isn't able to make some of these longer lasting changes, at the very least, some of these self-advocacy skills, for example, would provide them with useful tools to help themselves in their lives, regardless of whether or not they want to focus on these things as they continue. And in particular, the intervention that I sort of identified was a consultation or mentorship type program or sessions in which we would have Asian American mentors that our beneficiaries, these Asian American young adults, could relate to, feel comfortable with, and that who could teach them and inform them about both the importance of working in areas that aren't what is stereotyped upon them, or being able to speak up for themselves, just making them more aware of the fact that their identity is something they can talk about and that they can address to work with. And then I also thought this solution was a good way to fill the gap that I identified in the existing work with the organizations and schools that were trying to address this issue, by providing a specified solution to this issue of placing people in public facing jobs or helping people self-advocate and working at the individual level with these consultation or mentorship sessions. I thought that this was a good way to get that done. Then connecting this back to my larger vision, again, with Connie Chung, I think that if we are able to inspire some of these people to enter other spaces, one of the main issues that I saw people face is that when they look at areas that they're not represented in, such as politics, there are less than 20 Asian American Congress members currently. There's a feeling that that's not a space for you, that you don't belong, that you shouldn't try to go there because that's not what you're meant to do. And if we are able to encourage people to enter those spaces, then maybe not in this same level as Connie Chung was able to do with her work, but to some degree, we would be able to make some of that change. And that's all.
Check out the full playlist from this year's 50 Days of Summer or visit kellercenter.princeton.edu/Tiger Challenge to learn more. Subscribe for more videos on entrepreneurship, design and design thinking, societal impact, and innovation coming out of Princeton University.